My next guest was born in London and has lived in Switzerland and America. He's an actor with more than 250 film credits to his name, including a Bond movie, and looking back on his career, he notes in his new autobiography that acting has been good to him because it's allowed him to play golf all over the world. From Dracula to Scaramanga, Fu Manchu to The Wicker Man, and plenty more besides. 246 more to be exact. Will you welcome, please, Christopher Lee. It's a joy to have you with us, Christopher.
Thank you, David.
Looking at the book, there's this wonderful dedication at the front that the PR girl for United Artists on The Man with the Golden Gun said to you, "You're writing an autobiography, who's it about?"
Yes,
is that a true story?
Absolutely true.
And they've said that this book is also timed to be on the 100th anniversary of Dracula as well, of course.
Yeah, well, it is, but I think that's pure coincidence. From my point of view, what's much more important is that it's my 50th anniversary in show business.
50th?
50 years, yes. Unlike some of my colleagues who are unveiling plaques and getting huge publicity plugs for 50 years, I haven't really even mentioned it. It just so happens that it is.
And in fact, one of the things that comes out in the book is that some people know what they want to do when they're 2 or 3, but in fact, during your childhood, you didn't really think you were going to be an actor?
No.
At all?
No, never even thought about it. Never thought about it at all. The idea was that if one had the private means, because you did need them in those days, and I think you still do, that I would be in the diplomatic service, for instance, which would have been an utter disaster, because I do have an unfortunate habit of saying what I think. And they do say, as you know, the famous quote, "A diplomat is somebody sent abroad to lie for their country." And I'm not sure that I would have been able to do it very successfully. So actually it never came to that because there was no money. Everything was lost. And it was only by sheer chance, by sheer coincidence, that one day a relative of mine suddenly said to me, "Have you ever thought of being an actor?" And I suppose it's the old story that if you like, the rifle or the gun is loaded. It merely needs that extra pressure on the trigger, and there you are.
And during that period before you decided to become an actor, there's one description that must have been an awesome experience. You actually witnessed the last public execution in France.
That's right.
That reads as absolutely chilling.
Well, of course it was, as you can very well imagine. I mean, the guillotine itself, which I myself operated in a film about the French Revolution, made in 1989, of course, the bicentenary. The guillotine itself, the assembly of it, this stark object standing on the street, because it was always in public in those days, was pretty horrendous machine. They called it that, La Machine. But there was this American war correspondent, or Webb Miller, to whom I'd been introduced, and I was in France. I can't quite remember why, but I was either going down on a holiday to the south of France or coming back in those days. He said, "You might as well find out, young man, about the realities of life. So, you know, every experience is a positive one, or you should learn from it, or whatever." Perhaps he thought I would be a mass murderer or something, and this would be a good way of putting me off. But at any rate, we did go, and it was unlike anything. Well, obviously during a war you see some ghastly things, and on occasions in films when there are accidents. But the sheer coldness of it, and this package being hauled out of the prison so that his feet barely touched the ground, with his shirt cut away around his neck, probably having had a very large brandy, I don't know, but that was, I believe, the custom, although that's not enough. And seeing these 2 men, short men, in their overcoats and hats standing by this machine, and then the 2 men bring him out. And it's all done so fast. I don't want to go into details, they're too chilling. But it was so fast, I turned my head away, and in fact, I was behind him. So I did not see the obvious conclusion. But it was sickening, there's no question about it, and I was only whatever it was. It was 1938 or 9, I've forgotten now, but I was, whatever it was, 16 or 17 years old.
Ironic, the man who was to be the master of horror, seeing what horror could be like in real life.
Oh, yes. And also, of course, I don't know if I mentioned it in the book or not, I was, for a time after the war, in war crimes investigation, which did, of course, mean that one had to find some of the people who had committed atrocities, be actually present at the places where these atrocities had been committed. In some cases, they hadn't been entirely cleaned up, which is perhaps a polite way of glossing over it. And also, in some cases, having to be present right up to the end. And that is where I first met the late Albert Pierpoint. But I have to say, quite honestly, if you had seen, and unless you're my generation, you won't have seen it except on film or heard about it, something like the Holocaust or similar genocide, which is still going on in the world today, if you'd seen what these people did, I don't think you would have had any hesitation, I certainly wouldn't, of being the one on the other end of the lever. Really. One had absolutely no qualms, none of us that I can recall.
Moving back from real-life horror to horror in the movies and so on, Boris Karloff was clearly quite an influence, quite a mentor of yours, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. He was a marvellous man. We had quite a few things in common. We were both fanatics about cricket and to a certain extent also about rugby union. Boris, this is where we don't have anything in common, was married certainly 5 times, if not more. In fact, I remember asking the late Evie Karloff if she was his 5th wife, and she said, as far as I know, because that side of his life is very, very much a secret. His daughter even told me that a few months ago. But Boris was a very kind and very delightful, very warm-hearted man, and in my opinion, a brilliant actor. A brilliant actor. And it just so happened that we worked together 3 times. I tried to keep off the subject. I didn't want to sort of give him the impression that I was pumping him for information. And we never really talked about it very much. He knew perfectly well that I'd played a Frankenstein creature. He knew perfectly well that I'd just finished playing the first Dracula, but he never discussed it. The only time I ever asked him anything, he said, yes, of course, in that makeup, in the first Frankenstein film, which was, of course, one of the great films of all time, he said, I did have to wear for 24 hours once. And it was absolutely appalling, because he had this lisp. And that must have been ghastly. And then he said, playing the mummy, he didn't dare take a breath because that would split the bandages, and that was the whole point of the mummy coming back to life. Otherwise, I talked to him about his days as a star in Hollywood, as it then was, and accurately so, Hollywood. And we talked about the studios, and we talked about being under contract to studios, and we talked about the fact that the films that he did with people like Lugosi and Paul Muni and so on and so forth were major films from the major studios, major films, and of course the great Lon Chaney before him. And I said, well, then you must have met this head of the studio, that head of the studio. You must have known him, you must have known him, you must have known him. And I'll never forget his answer. He said, they were all monsters. Which I think undoubtedly they were, but they knew how to make movies. And that's the major difference between that period and today.
How would you compare the challenge of Frankenstein and the challenge of Dracula?
Well, I have to quote Boris here. Of course, they're both enormous challenges. All these characters are huge challenges because you are trying to make the unbelievable believable, basically. And I think we succeeded. Lon Chaney, the great master, Lon Chaney Sr., once said to Boris, who then passed it on to me, find something that other actors cannot do or will not do. And if you create an impact and make your mark thereby, you will never be forgotten. The challenge was enormous. In one case, a dumb, sad, helpless creature put together from bits and pieces of others. How can you actually tell somebody how to act a part like that? It's a question of instinct and one's own powers of invention. The other, an immortal, a heroic, romantic, and very erotic character. And the only way in which I could cope with that was quite simply because I'd read the book. And I had some very imaginative people around me, In both cases, of course, my late and very, very dear friend Peter Cushing, who was already a very established actor and a superb human being and a wonderful actor.
And what one of the reactions to your performance here, one letter from a cinema manager in the north of England reported that an usherette of his had said she was pregnant by Dracula, presumably from seeing him 5 times a day for a week, and that you should have done, why didn't you do the decent thing?
I'll tell you, it's quite true that actually, only it wasn't in 1957. It was a few years later. I was making a film at Shepperton, and I got a telephone call from this man who said, I think you ought to know, Mr. Lee, that my secretary, Mrs. Burton-on-Trent, very romantic place, has come to me and has said that she's had a baby and it's yours, you're the father. I said, well, I think that rather unwise of her to say that, because it's not true. So what, of course, had happened was that you get fan letters, right?
Right.
They ask for photographs. You sign the photograph. Okay. This woman had been unwise enough to write a series of passionate love letters between me and her, but she'd typed them. And I have yet to hear of a passionate love letter being typed. Anyway, she typed them because she couldn't possibly copy my writing, but she copied my signature. Well, that didn't last very long, but it can happen, you know. One is a bit vulnerable sometimes.
And you nearly, before you eventually appeared in a Bond film, Man with the Golden Gun, because Ian Fleming was your cousin, the author, you almost could have got in at the very beginning.
Yes, Ian told me that he wanted me to play Dr. No. I think he'd seen me playing a Chinese in a film. Not necessarily Fu Manchu, but a Chinese. I once played a Chinese detective in German. I don't know how you're supposed to do that, but I did. And he wanted me to play Dr. No because I was the right height. And he'd seen me in a film in which I'd had articulated hands. And of course, in the book, Dr. No is immensely tall, wears a platform so as to make himself look even taller, wears contact lenses, and I think he'd seen me wearing those. And he taps these contact lenses with his steel hands, saying, these things, they tell me things, or they tell me everything. And I think the combination of having perhaps seen me in all these different areas decided him, I don't think it was a question of nepotism or keeping it in the family or anything like that, decided him that I was the right person to play it. By the time he mentioned this to Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, of course, they'd already cast a very fine actor, Joseph Wiseman, as Dr. No. So, you know, you win a few, you lose a few. And if only I could get this through to people today, that becoming an actor is not just a walk in the park. All too many, sadly, have their hand out before they step in front of the camera.
Well, I think when you look at the Equity sometimes publish the average wages of an actor, even including the star actors, it still comes out lower than the overall average.
And in America, too.
Yeah, same thing over there.
85% unemployment on any one day in the acting profession. It's a frightening figure.
That's why if you're having a dinner party in Los Angeles, people rush home at 10:30 because they want to be able to say, I've got to be up early the next morning, even if they don't have
That's
to
right.
be. It's too bad.
That's true.
They can't.
Well, I didn't attend those sort of parties. I was told by many people, oh, you must go to this one, you must go to that one. Well, I've never been particularly social. I've never been a party goer. And I had no desire to go. And I was quite right, because I met a lot of very distinguished actors. Many of them became very good friends of mine. And I remember they all said to me the same thing. Not once had any of us got one single worthwhile role or part out of going to a party. All the people I knew in show business in America, which is vaster than anywhere else, basically, doesn't make as many films as they do in India, but that's not the point I'm making. As an industry, it's enormous, particularly in television as well. They all said to me, actors, directors, producers, look, if you stay in England, you'll make an adequate living, and you'll probably never be offered in anything particularly different from what you made your name in or whatever. But if you want to change the image, if you want to show that you do possess any versatility, that you can do this, that, and the other, this is the place to be, because you will be given the opportunity and you will be given the chance if you say you can do it, but you'd better deliver. In other words, can you do this? Yes. Show us here. We've seen you do it, but now you show us. So at the beginning, I knew I'd have to take a lot of risks, many of them physical. And it did begin to spread, and I was doing comedy, I was doing westerns, I was doing straight stories, I was doing musical, I was doing everything you can think of. In other words, I did show that I wasn't confined to the playing of any one particular kind of role in any one particular kind of film. That was what I achieved in America, and I shall always be grateful.
Well, you've travelled a lot, of course, with various movies and everything else, and we see in the book your love affair with golf as well.
Yes.
What, in the whole of the world, is your favourite golf course?
Very difficult. You notice I'm pausing before I give an answer, because it's one of three. The famous Pine Valley in New Jersey, which is probably the toughest course in America. World famous it is. Seminole in Florida, and of course my own course, which I'm privileged to be a member in Scotland. Its full name is the Honourable Company of Edinburgh Golfers. I would say it's a toss-up between the three, but I think I would come out with Muirfield.
Muirfield by a short head?
Yes.
On the 18th
By a short putt.
Yeah, a short putt, that was absolutely right.
Yeah.
Well, now, music, of course, has been a very important part of your life.
Yes.
What would you like to hear now musically?
I think if I may be allowed to do so, I make an unashamed plug for myself here. In 1996, when I was 74, untrained singer, unable to read music, I was asked if I would like to make my own album. Now, I've done a lot of singing in films, quite a lot, and I've made things like The Soldier's Tale by Stravinsky. I've done Peter and the Wolf, which you don't sing in that. I've done The King and I, which comes out very soon. I've done Wandering Star, and so on and so forth. But nobody had actually said to me, we know you can sing, so make a record. So I said, okay, and they said, well, obviously, the kind of characters that you'll be singing will be the bad boys, usually the basses or the baritones. And I said, yes, fine. So the record, I think, is called Sings Rogues, Devils and Villains from Broadway to Bayreuth. So I sang in English, I sang in French, I sang in German, I sang in Russian, I sang in Italian. So now I think I'm going to surprise people, not only by singing in English, but by singing one of the most famous cowboy western songs with a western accent like that. And
Fantastic.
it's called The Streets of Laredo. As I walked out in the streets of Laredo, as I walked out in Laredo one day, I spied a young cowboy all wrapped in white linen, all wrapped in white linen, as cold as the clay. I see by your outfit that you are a cowboy. These words he did say as I boldly stepped by. Come sit down beside me and hear my sad story. I was shot in the breast and I know I must die. It was once in the saddle I used to go dashing. It was once in the saddle I used to make hay. First to the dram house and then to the card house. Got shot in the breast, I am dying today. Get 6 jolly cowboys to carry my coffin. Get 6 pretty maidens to carry my pall. Put bunch bunches of roses all over my coffin. Roses to deaden the clods as they fall. Oh, beat the drum slowly and play the fife lowly. Play the dead march as you carry me along. Take me to the green valley and lay the sod o'er me. For I'm a young cowboy and I know I've done wrong. Oh, beat the drum slowly and play the fife lowly. Play the dead march as you carry me along. Take me to the green valley and lay the sod o'er me. For I'm a young cowboy and I know I've done wrong.
That was Christopher Lee, the singer. And now we say thank you to Christopher Lee, the author of Tall, Dark and Gruesome, and Christopher Lee, the speaker here today. Christopher, thank you so much.
Not a bit, David. It was a pleasure.
And for me.
Thank you.